All right, in today's lecture series, we're going to be looking into photosynthesis. All right, this is our second part of our series on photosynthesis and cell respiration, or energy transfer. And today we're tackling the question from our introduced photosynthesis, in which where is the energy coming in at that allows us to break down the water and the carbon dioxide to make glucose and oxygen. So we first got to kind of start with the question, what is light? All right. So first of all, when we talk about light, light is something that has no mass and it's not made up of matter. It is pure energy. And so when we look at pure energy like a photon, we want to take in consideration two different things, frequency and wavelength. Because here's the deal, depending on when that light and energy was produced from those falling electrons, it can determine the power or the wavelength of which that photon is released. And so, depending on the frequency and wavelength, it's going to interact differently with different things in the environment. Wavelengths that are very tall, I mean, we're talking about the size of almost an entire building. Those are going to be radio waves. And them being that big, they do not interact with anybody or anything around them necessarily. But as the frequency gets a little bit more and more, we get to a point right here. And that is the wavelength in which our cells in our eyes are able to see and interact with. It's this frequency that allows us to be able to see everything around us in the world, okay? Now, if we increase the amount of frequency, then what we start to see is smaller and smaller waves, and this is where we start getting to energy in which we can start having things like cancer or affecting the cell, so cell damage, etc., like that. So we're just gonna focus on the visible spectrum, and so on the lower end of the wavelength, we have our reds and oranges, then yellows and greens, and then we go from our blues to violets, okay? Now, for photosynthesis, we want to ask these questions. What is absorbed in terms of light? What is reflected? And what is transmitted? So let's take a look at those terms right here. When we talk about something that is being absorbed, we're talking about it that it's taking in that light energy. I'll go ahead and put that down here. So with absorb, that is taking in energy. Now, when things are reflected, that means that energy is, like it says, it's reflected. It's not absorbed. I'm going to go ahead and put that here. They are not absorbed. And then you have transmissions, which, it appears clear and it goes straight through. Okay, now, how does this apply to photosynthesis? Okay, well, if we go back out, what we're going to find out, especially in the lab, we're going to see that leaves have different chlorophyll, all right? And again, remember chlorophyll, we looked at the structure of chlorophyll, and depending on the shape of that molecule, it does have the ability to absorb light wavelengths at different wavelengths, all right? So for plants here, if we're looking at our graph here, here's the amount of light absorbed, meaning that when it's absorbing light, it's absorbing energy. And that energy can be involved with breaking down the water and CO2 into glucose. So as we can see, our purples, our blues, and everything, it's absorbed. Now, we have many different types of chlorophyll, and we're going to see that in our chromatography lab in class. However, the reason why these plants have many different types of chlorophyll, if we kind of see carotenoid, which is the orange color we see in the leaves, especially in the fall, does a really good job of absorbing light at this frequency. Whereas chlorophyll A is good at absorbing red and blue, or red and oranges, and also purples and violets. And then we also have chlorophyll B, which is really good at absorbing light at this wavelength. However, you probably noticed in the green and yellow, we have little to no absorption. The reason is, well, because of the pigment of chlorophyll, green light is reflected. And since the green light's reflected, this is why we see these plants as green light, because they are reflecting that green nature to them. And so for chloroplasts, they appear green to us because they are absorbing purple, blues, oranges, and reds. Remember that in our chloroplast, in these little thylakoids, we have a special pigment called chlorophyll. So, what kind of light do plants absorb? Violet, blue, orange, and red. Reflects green and some yellow. Now, we understand the chlorophyll is absorbing the energy. The sun is providing the energy. Now, what is actually happening that allows carbon dioxide to be broken down into the glucose and water producing my oxygen? All right, so we're going to look at the process, and the process involves two different steps. We're going to be going over the light reactions today, this portion right here, okay? And both cycles occur in the chloroplast. So we're starting off the light-dependent cycle in the thylakoid. So let's take a look here. So where does photosynthesis occur? Well, if we're talking about light reactions, they occur in the membranes of the thylakoids, all right? That's one thing you want to highlight right there, is that light reactions happen in the thylakoids. The Calvin cycle, which is the light-independent cycle, meaning it doesn't need light to do it, that's going to happen in the stroma. From our classes, we've kind of gotten, so now I have enough knowledge to understand the enzymes and phospholipids and such, but I do want to introduce one new character that's involved here. These are proteins that are what we call high electron carriers. These are special proteins that have the ability to capture electrons and transfer that energy. And I'm going to put that on here just because it's so doggone important. The big thing about these is that they transport electrons, aka energy. And so these electrons are removed from the water. So we have our why water is there. So water is giving away its electrons. Now, when we talk about reducing, we got to remember that we're talking about things that are being reduced or gaining those electrons, and those are being oxidized, are giving those electrons away. So water is giving away the electrons in this case. And CO2 is going to be broken down to make our particular glucose. Now, excuse me, you do not need to know the entire process, all right, of the light-dependent cycle. But the big thing that you should know is that, number one, water molecules are used and broken down by light to produce ATP and NADH, all right? So that's our goal for everything. As you can see, the light-dependent cycle doesn't have anything to do with CO2. That happens in the next cycle, okay? But let's take a look at the light, okay? So big thing that's happening here, again, we're in the thylakoid membrane. So we're in between the thylakoid here, and here is my stroma, all right? Now, you have these embedded protein channels, all right? And some of them contain the chlorophyll, all right? Excuse me. And so what ends up happening is that the light interacts with the water and breaks it down, all right? And that's where the connection between the light energy to chemical energy is used. And so that energy used to break apart that water into oxygen, and take a look. These hydrogens are going to be important, and they're going to build up in my thylakoid space. Now that electron, what it does is that it powers through, gets knocked with light again, and ends up transferring that electron that was from water into our high electron carriers, the NADP, all right? And when they become reduced with that electron, they become NADPH, and that's going to go into the Calvin cycle. Now, this player right here is so important. ATP synthase, what it does is that it creates ATP. Remember, we are trying to make cell energy. So yes, photosynthesis does make energy. However, it is very little. It only makes a few ATP. And unfortunately, we don't say that photosynthesis makes ATP because, well, this ATP is going to be going to the Calvin cycle to be used to create our glucose. So the net energy amount is 0 from photosynthesis because that energy is made by the ATP synthase is going into our glucose dependent cycle just a little bit more molecule. So light dependent reactions, these are the main things that you need to know. Number 1, water is used, broken down by light energy and gives away an electron. Oxygen is the waste product. It excites electrons using photons to produce 2 high-energy molecules, NADPH and ATP. Both of these then go to the Calvin cycle. And the Calvin cycle is where we are actually making the glucose itself. Now, all right, so again, just to kind of put this in perspective, when you're looking at that leaf, well, what you're looking at is a tissue. Within those tissues, you have individual cells that have these chloroplasts. And these chloroplasts then allow it to collect sunlight energy by the chlorophyll that's located in these thylakoids. Here's my chlorophyll. They absorb the energy. They break apart water. They transfer that electron into our high electron carriers. And as a result, the buildup of hydrogens in here goes from an area of high concentration to that of a low concentration. And as a result, this wonderful protein makes our energy. We'll come back to this, ATP, okay? Now, here's the thing. We've only done half of the reaction, and the only thing we have made is ATP and NADPH. We do not have our glucose yet, all right? And that's going to happen in the Calvin cycle, and that'll be in our next lesson. Thank you.